Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to Curious Kingdom. This story revolves around a man who has experienced a remarkable 14,000 years of life without showing any signs of aging. Every decade, he relocates to a new place to avoid attracting attention. However, when he decides to disclose the true reason behind his departures to his colleagues, an interesting conversation ensues. As everyone gathers inside the house, engaging in conversations, one of John's colleagues named Dan expresses surprise at his sudden departure and wonders if there's a problem. John reassures Dan, but his curiosity grows, prompting him to ask where John plans to go after his 10-year stint as a professor. Edith, another colleague, chimes in, mentioning that John hasn't aged in the past decade. This revelation piques the curiosity of all the lecturers, who are eager to unravel the secret. John simply explains that he enjoys moving around from time to time, emphasizing that it's a personal choice he feels compelled to make. While enjoying a whiskey, they all toast to John's long life and good fortune, raising a glass in celebration. They then inquire about plans for the rest of the afternoon. During the conversation, Dan discovers a tool dating back 17,000 to 11,500 years, belonging to the Magdalene culture, also known as the Upper Paleolithic period. This ancient artifact amazes everyone. At this point, John appears slightly concerned, with Harry remarking that he seems to be deliberately creating a mystery. Harry urges John to speak up if he has something to say. Taking a moment, John finally shares his thoughts and poses a seemingly nonsensical question. What if a man from the Upper Paleolithic era survived until the present day without ever dying? Dan finds the idea intriguing, wondering if John is writing a science fiction story. John playfully acknowledges it, and they proceed to discuss what such a man would be like. Harry suggests that the hypothetical man would likely be exhausted from his prolonged existence. Dan takes a more serious approach, stating that if the man had lived for 14,000 years with normal intelligence, he would be indistinguishable from any of them anatomically. The lecturers reflect on the intelligence level of humans during the Upper Paleolithic era and assume that the man would have gradually acquired knowledge over time, becoming remarkably learned if he possessed a curious mind. The conversation turns to the possibility of John writing a book about this concept, prompting Linda, an art student, to ask what could have kept the man alive for so long. Harry, being a biologist, explains that the human body is naturally designed to live up to 190 years, but most individuals succumb to slow poisoning. However, in the realm of science fiction, if the man's body functioned flawlessly, regenerating cells perfectly, he could live for thousands of years. Harry highlights that various body parts undergo complete cell renewal within specific time frames, such as the pancreas in 24 hours, the stomach lining in 3 days, and the entire body in 7 years. With a perfectly detoxified and renewed body, he could potentially evade decay. The group reflects on the shift from belief in magic to reliance on science, drawing parallels to the time when Columbus discovered a new route to India, and many people initially deemed him mad. John mentions that he had the opportunity to sail with Columbus and was already aware that the earth was round, although he had some concerns about the possibility of falling off the edge at certain points. This revelation surprises John's colleagues, prompting Harry to humorously refer to him as an ancient Cro Magnon who has lived until the present day. In response, John makes a peculiar sound, leading everyone to burst into laughter. Sandy, who had gone to get some food, returns and inquires about the commotion. Art explains that John claims to be 14,000 years old. Sandy playfully teases John, remarking that he doesn't look a day over 900. This intriguing revelation sparks the curiosity of the group, and they express a desire to hear more about John's story. John explains that every decade or so, people would begin to notice that he doesn't age, which would prompt him to move on. He shares that he aged normally until around 35 years old but eventually left his group due to being perceived as magical. He didn't have to fight for this reputation, but eventually, fear set in, and they chased him away, believing that he was somehow stealing their lives to remain young. John admits that he doesn't remember everything and that his memory is selective, focusing on the significant moments, both positive and negative, as well as traumatic events that tend to stay with him forever. To avoid being constantly pursued, John developed the strategy of changing groups and periodically moving on. He recounts that the first 2,000 years were characterized by cold temperatures, while the lower terrains experienced warmer climates. Over time, the glaciers melted, revealing the seas, and rising sea levels caused the separation of continents. Art mentions that this information can be found in any textbook, to which John responds that books helped him recall his memories, although it is impossible to remember every detail from 14,000 years. Linda asks if John ever wondered about the origins of humanity, to which he explains that they would gaze up at the sky and ponder the existence of superior beings above while they remained below. Initially, John questioned if there was something wrong with him, believing he might be a bad person for not aging. However, he eventually wondered if he was cursed or blessed. considering the possibility of having a mission. He concludes that it simply happened without a specific reason. Linda follows up by asking why John can't remember his place of origin since geography hasn't changed. John responds by stating that he migrated across vast expanses, encountering endless new landscapes such as forests, mountains, tundra, and canyons. His memory recalls what he witnessed, but his eyes now see highways and urban development as the world expanded over time. He also admits to getting caught a few times, recounting an incident where he spent a year in jail for falsifying a government application. Art raises a question to John, stating that he has an answer for every question except one: why is John behaving this way? In response, John explains that he wanted to bid farewell to his colleagues as himself, rather than as the person they perceived him to be. Art becomes concerned and decides to retreat to another room. Meanwhile, John begins moving some boxes, and Dan asks if he possesses any relics or artifacts that remind him of his early life. John elaborates, questioning whether one would still hold on to such an artifact after living for so many years. He ponders the concept of beginnings and emphasizes that even without that concept, the artifact would eventually disappear or be lost. He confirms that he doesn't possess any artifacts and tells them to keep the thought. As John moves the boxes out, confusion arises among the group as to whether he is being serious. Harry starts searching for any hidden microphones or cameras, while Art calls Dr. Will Gruber, a psychiatry professor, informing him about John's erratic behavior and urging him to come as soon as possible. Sandy expresses her love for John, asking if he could love her. John responds by stating that he cares for her, holds affection for her, and is undoubtedly attracted to her. He further explains that while she and any children they have would age, he would not. Sandy shares her personal history, mentioning her parents' separation before she was born and her mother's subsequent marriage that lasted only 3 years. She acknowledges the uncertainty of life, encompassing deaths, illnesses, and acts of God, and declares her love for John, accepting whatever he can offer. John humorously remarks that it would be around 10 years. The scene then abruptly cuts to them entering the house, where Harry unexpectedly grabs John from behind, prompting John to defend himself. When questioned about his actions, John explains that he wanted to test John's reflexes. John responds by saying he doesn't have eyes at the back of his head and that he is by no means a Superman. Some individuals express that they still have questions, including inquiries about John's remembrance of his original language. John admits to having some recollection, stating that one thing hasn't changed, and he proceeds to whistle. In response, Linda asks if John ever created any cave art. John explains that his friend used to draw depictions of the animals they hoped to find for sustenance. Linda connects this to the reason why students perceive John's knowledge of history as extraordinary, to which John responds that it is mostly based on study, resulting from his solitary perspective on the world he once knew nothing about. Dan requests John to elaborate on the aspects he didn't know about. John continues by discussing the following few thousand years, remarking on the increasing warmth and the transition from hunting to agriculture, raising animals instead of relying solely on hunting. Art interjects, listing various animals such as reindeer, mammoths, bison, and horses, while emphasizing that this information is common knowledge found in textbooks. John playfully agrees, mentioning that even Art's textbook got most of it right. Eventually, John headed east, driven by curiosity and a desire to explore the world. He became adept at blending in and moving alone, experiencing the Bronze Age's onset. Along the way, he followed trade routes, traded copper and tin, and learned new languages as he traveled. He encountered diverse creation myths and numerous gods. Eventually, he began to suspect that much of what he had learned was a fabrication. He spent 2,000 years as a Sumerian before transitioning to being Babylonian. John explains that moving on became easier during the hunter-gatherer phase, more challenging when villages merged, and even tougher in city-states with centralized authority, where strangers were viewed with suspicion. It seemed as though he was always on the move. He acquired various tricks and even feigned his own death on a couple of occasions. John continued his journey eastward, reaching India where he fortuitously met the extraordinary man known as Buddha. John studied with Buddha until his passing, and although Buddha sensed there was something different about John, he was never explicitly told the truth. Art questions whether John himself is sharing this information with them and expresses concerns about whether they might disclose it to others. John responds that their disbelief would cause his story to vanish, and even if they were to believe him for a short while, it would quickly fade away. John anticipates that some would label him as psychotic, while others would become angry. At that moment, Dr. Will Gruber arrives, recalling that Art had called him due to concerns about John's behavior. Dr. Gruber asks John if he is indeed a caveman, to which John clarifies that he belonged to the Cro Magnon era. Will inquires when John became aware of this, and John explains that he became aware when anthropologists first identified the Cro Magnons and gave them a name. Will then asks if John has ever experienced illness during his vast lifetime. John reveals that throughout prehistory, He might have experienced pneumonia once or twice, but in the last few hundred years, he has encountered various diseases such as typhoid, yellow fever, and smallpox. When asked about smallpox scars, John states that he doesn't scar. Harry suggests that John undergo a medical test to validate his claims. But John declines, expressing fear that he might be confined for 1,000 years or maybe turned into a guinea pig. People have tried to understand John, and Harry asks if John believes he would betray them in any way. John cryptically replies, "Walls have ears." Dan inquires if John has acquired extensive knowledge, to which John shares that he possesses 10 degrees, including those held by his colleagues, spanning a span of 170 years. He obtained his biology degree at Oxford in 1840 when knowledge was limited in many fields. Dan acknowledges John's point that no matter how long a person lives, they cannot surpass the knowledge of their time or possess more knowledge than the best minds of their era. John clarifies that living for 14,000 years did not make him a genius. He simply had time to accumulate knowledge. Will interjects, asking if shooting John would result in his survival, suggesting the possibility of immortality. John clarifies that he never claimed to be immortal, just old, and acknowledges the potential for his eventual demise. Will asks if John has ever wished for it to end, to which John replies negatively. As people arrive to collect the furniture for charity, John instructs them to take everything but leave one couch for the ladies and the elderly. Will brings up how some of John's early companions believed he was stealing their lives, prompting John to reflect on the legends surrounding such beings. A creature not entirely human, taking not blood but the life force itself, perhaps unconsciously through some biological or psychic mechanism that remains unknown. John clarifies that he is not suggesting he would intentionally engage in such actions or even possess the ability to do so. Will points out that John's revelations have caused envy among them. Will raises a revolver and suggests shooting John's arm to observe the healing process. However, Dan intervenes, urging Will to hand over the gun and subsequently revealing that his wife passed away from cancer the previous day. Realizing Will's emotional pain, John rushes to apologize and asks for the revolver. Will reluctantly hands it over. After the brief interruption, the group expresses their eagerness to hear more of John's story. Dan wonders if there might be others like John, to which John recalls meeting a man in the 1,600 seconds who seemed similar, but from a different time and place. They conversed for 2 days, finding the discussion quite convincing, yet unable to confirm the authenticity of each other's claims. They agreed to keep in touch, but as time passed, they lost contact. John mentions thinking he saw the man at a train station 200 years later but lost him in the crowd. Dan asks if John is religious, and John responds that he does not follow any specific religion, although he did in the distant past. When asked about his belief in God, John replies, "I have no need for that hypothesis," acknowledging that God may exist but remains uncertain. Dan inquires if John has encountered any figures from religious history, specifically biblical figures. John suggests skipping that topic, expressing hesitance and stating that the conversation is heading in an unexpected direction. The group decides to call it a night, but they insist that John continues sharing. John reluctantly obliges, stating that the entire Bible is mostly a mixture of myths, allegories, and historical events. He then summarizes the New Testament in fewer than 100 words. Edith, who strongly believes in the Bible, expresses reluctance to hear John's summary, considering it sacrilege. However, the group convinces her to stay. Harry encourages John to proceed with the abbreviated version, and John explains that a man encountered Buddha and found his teachings appealing. After contemplating for around 500 years, the man returned to the Mediterranean and assimilated into the Roman Empire as an Etruscan. However, he disapproved of the empire's transformation into a giant killing machine. He then ventured to the Near East, hoping to impart Buddhist teachings in a modern form. The man attempted a dissident movement against Rome, but Rome emerged victorious. The rest, John says, is history, albeit with many fairy tales intertwined. Edith concludes that John is claiming to be Christ, to which John clarifies that the title of Christ was attributed to him, fulfilling prophecy. Dan asks about the crucifixion, and John reveals that he blocked the pain using techniques he learned in Tibet and India. He also learned to slow down his bodily processes to the point of being undetectable, leading others to believe he was dead. His followers then removed him from the cross and placed him in a cave, where his body normalized. John attempted to slip away unnoticed but was intercepted by ecstatic devotees who believed in his resurrection. To distance himself, he ascended to Central Europe. Art asks to see John's wrists, but John reiterates that he doesn't scar. Additionally, John draws a comparison between pagan mythology and Christianity. Dan asserts that early Christian leaders discarded Hebrew manuscripts and drew inspiration from pagan sources. He further suggests that the teachings of Jesus and Buddha convey similar messages of kindness, tolerance, brotherhood, and love. John confirms that those were indeed the teachings he espoused. However, he notes that many stories were later fabricated. John posits that priests invented the concepts of heaven and hell to exert control through seduction and terror. Will, who had left but returned, expresses skepticism and says that he drove and sat for a while, feeling ashamed but still unable to believe John's claims. John leads him inside, emphasizing that everyone requires assistance. Will remarks that some individuals require more help than others. They inquire about what happened during John's absence. Art raises a question about the name Jesus. John responds by stating that he called himself John, which is typically his choice. As tales of his resurrection spread, the name became intertwined with the Hebrew name Yachanan, meaning God is gracious. John's presence on earth was seen as divine evidence of immortality, which led to the phrase God is salvation or Hebrew Yeshua. This translation eventually evolved into John's proper name, changing to late Greek Lasu, then to late Latin Lisa, and finally to medieval Latin Jesus. John reflects on how fascinating it was to witness this transformation unfold. Dan then asks if John claimed to be the Son of God. John clarifies that he acknowledged having a master who was greater than himself, but he never proclaimed that the master was his father. His aim was to teach what he had learned. John denies claiming to be the king of the Jews, walking on water, raising the dead, or speaking of divinity, except in the context of human goodness on earth. He admits to using some healing methods based on Eastern medicine and conducting teaching sessions on a hill, although not many people stayed to listen. John offered them a choice. Who do you think I am? Edith becomes emotional and starts crying, with many others almost believing in John's words. Will intervenes, urging John to stop, asserting that things have gone too far and that he doesn't believe John is mad, but the statements are untrue. Will demands that John reveal the truth to the people. After a moment of silence, John admits that it was all a story. Disappointment fills the room, and John acknowledges that he took it too far, fueled by the perfect audience consisting of anthropologists, archaeologists, Christian literalists, and a psychologist. The group becomes angry, sad, and disappointed, gradually leaving. Sandy, however, still believes that John was speaking the truth, as he did not manipulate or exploit their trust and intelligence. Sandy expresses a desire to know John's real name, to which John responds that his name has always been John, he merely changed his surname. He recalls the names of some individuals in the group and mentions that about 60 years ago, when he was teaching at Harvard, he went by the name John Tea Party, which Will finds difficult to believe. John challenges Will, asking about his mother's name, Nola. Will initially tries to deny it and asks about the name of their dog. John answers correctly with Wooey, causing Will to become highly emotional. John expresses remorse, stating that he had to move on. As Will experiences a heart attack, an ambulance is called, but unfortunately, he passes away. Sandy remarks that John had never witnessed his grown child's death before. John mentions that he hadn't, takes his car, and drives to the road, waiting. Sandy decides to join him, and the story concludes. Man from Earth is a captivating exploration of human curiosity, beliefs, and the complex nature of existence, leaving viewers with many questions to ponder. That's all for today, folks. Like, share, and subscribe for more such content. Curious Knight signing off. Stay safe, stay curious.